I'm Dr. Rayshawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power, and this is my daily thought. I just want to know what ancient black activist crawled up in Michael Jordan's body. I mean, the stuff that this guy's doing right now is just completely out of character for him. For those to bring people up to speed, he gave $1 million to an organization, or to two organizations. One dealing with police brutality, the other one a police organization dealing with community relations, to build better community relations with local communities, particularly local black communities. He also gave $5 million to the new African American History Museum, the new Smithsonian Museum in DC. If you haven't had a chance to see that interactive tour, I recommend that you check it out. Go ahead and get your ticket. Next time you're in Washington, D.C., you should definitely go check it out. I mean, it's completely monumental for our country, as well as for the world, to be able to see a place, a repository housing all of this information in one place like a Smithsonian Museum. And while you're here, go look at some of the other monuments as well, whether that be MLK or Abe Lincoln or FDR, which is one of my favorite ones to go to. So, well, what's interesting is that the question is why do we see Michael Jordan doing this, right? I mean, obviously we see other athletes doing this sort of stuff. I mean, obviously the Colin Kaepernick situation. Colin Kaepernick is still protesting by not standing for the national anthem. And there are some people who are like, you know, I find it disrespectful. I find it disrespectful to the flag. Why do you find it disrespectful to the flag? It's not disrespectful to the flag, right? This is inherently American, right? You can't pick and choose what you decide to let people protest and use their free speech for, right? I mean, it really doesn't work that way, right? And what's interesting is if you're still not getting why it's not about the flag, right? And instead why this is about human rights, then I talked about this a while back. You should check that out. But for Colin Kaepernick, he holds a special place in my heart because my two boys suffer from a rare condition called neonatal lupus. One of the main outcomes is congenital heart block. Thank God that they avoided that. But Colin Kaepernick has raised over $1 million for children who have heart problems. His jersey sales have also skyrocketed, and he said that he's going to donate his proceeds from his jerseys to local communities, right? To deal with some of these issues. I mean, these are just two of the things that he's doing. So when people say that, you know, what else is he doing besides standing up and, you know, protesting and those sorts of things? I mean, he's doing many things. I think athletes do many things that people don't necessarily see. And even though I think that it's important for athletes and entertainers to speak up and speak out, particularly when they're informed about what's going on, I don't necessarily think it's an obligation for them to do so. I think it's part of this burden that they face is dealing with this talented 10th that W.B. Du Bois talked about, with the top 10% of particularly the black community take on this burden to speak up and speak out and represent the entire race, whether it be a person being one of the only black people in class, one of the only black people at their company, and they feel the need to speak up, and people look for them to basically say, what do all black people think, right? As if they all represent all black people, as if black people are a homogeneous group. And so I think for Colin Kaepernick, we're seeing that, right? And we're seeing that the athletes do a lot of things that people don't necessarily see. Michael Jordan, on the other hand, similar to what Kevin Blackistone, who is a Washington Post writer, works for ESPN, is oftentimes on Around the Horn. He's also a professor in the School of Journalism at the University of Maryland, one of my colleagues here. He essentially said about Jordan, it's a day late and a dollar short. And while I agree with Blackistone, I also think that it's something important about people shifting, right? And if you listen to what Michael Jordan said, he said, you know, I can no longer sit around and be silent. And I thought about that, and I was like, no longer sit around and be silent. This means you've seen what's been going on. You know what's been going on, and instead, you haven't necessarily been acknowledging it. You haven't wanted to face it. You haven't wanted to say anything about it. You haven't wanted to do anything about it, right? You haven't wanted to speak up and speak out. And that's a problem, right? Because if you actually think that racism or sexism or homophobia or classism go away by not talking about it, you live a very privileged life, right? And not only that, it's a shame that you actually feel that way, because that's just not true, right? Racism, sexism, homophobia, and classism will continue whether or not individual bigots, racists, sexists, classists, right, or homophobes exist at all, right? And so we really have to put that in particular perspective, particularly because these isms and racism operates on an institutional level, not just on an individual level. It operates through our policies, our rules, our norms, our values, right? And those things are going to continue whether or not people do anything about it or not. But I think the question becomes is why did Michael Jordan feel the need to come out and do these sorts of things, right? What led to this ancient black activist crawling up in his body, right? Well, I think probably similar to a lot of people, he saw the Fernando, Castile, and Alton Sterling killings, right? And he was very disturbed. I mean, as I was. I mean, personally, when I heard Diamond Reynolds' daughter, so Diamond was Fernando Castile's girlfriend who was in the vehicle with him when he was shot and killed. Her daughter was also with her, who was 4 years old. And while Diamond is crying out to God, asking for God to save Fernando Castile's life, the little 4-year-old goes, "Mommy, don't cry, I'm here." Mommy, don't cry, I'm here. I will never forget those words as long as I live. That did something to me, that changed me. I was in mourning for a very long time. I have a 4-year-old, right? Something else that disturbed me was the killing of Corinne Gaines in Baltimore, right? And not just the killing of Corinne Gaines, and she got killed by the police. Police were serving a warrant, came into her house, she had a gun. After a standoff, she didn't fire first, they fired at her, shot and killed her. They also shot her 5-year-old son. What disturbed me, even beyond Corinne Gaines' death, was a report later on that week that said, oh, the 5-year-old is recovering fine. How in the world is a 5-year-old who just got shot by the police, who just saw his mother killed by the police, who had essentially, according to his mother, been being stalked and profiled by the police, and according to the Department of Justice report on the city of Baltimore, there's no reason to doubt what Corinne Gaines was saying. How is he gonna be okay? I mean, see, what people don't realize is that people think after wounds heal physically, and even after you can't see them, that you don't necessarily still feel it, right? That there are still mental, psychological, and emotional wounds, right? It's kind of like a woman having a baby and having a C-section, right? I mean, even though they have all these lasers now, and the marking is really small, it doesn't mean that women still don't feel that pain in their stomach, right? And it still doesn't mean that they don't carry around the mental, emotional, and psychological scars and wounds of that particular C-section in that wound, in that incident, right? Particularly if it was an emergency C-section. And so I just find I find the way we talk about this stuff baffling, puzzling, and really confusing. Right? Not necessarily confusing. I mean, I get it, but I think for a lot of people it's confusing. And I was upset that Corinne Gaines didn't go national. So, I mean, as it relates to Michael Jordan, that could be one reason, right? And he's saying, gosh, Fernando Castile or Alton Sterling, that could be one of my sons, right? I mean, that could be me. I mean, my dad was actually killed by people, right? And that's the thing. We got to think, Michael Jordan is the same guy who said when tons of people were getting killed in Chicago, we got to think this dude played for the Chicago Bulls. The Chicago Bulls. Chicago has one of the highest murder rates in the nation, and it's primarily on the south side of Chicago. We got to be very specific about that, right? And part of being specific about that is disentangling criminality from blackness. Blackness doesn't make people criminals, right? It makes people lead to being profiled as being criminals, but blackness doesn't make people criminals, right? Blackness is not intricately or culturally or genetically tied to blackness, right? Blackness is not tied to criminality in that way. Instead, criminality is linked to racial segregation. It's linked to poverty. It's linked to a lack of jobs, right? It's linked to poor schools. We can put structural factors, structural conditions onto the reasons why we see crime operating the way it does. It's the same way like there are parts in West Virginia or in Indiana that have very high white populations, that have very high crime rates, right? We don't talk about those places. In fact, we just act like rural white people don't exist, right? And I see them all over, whether or not I'm going in upstate New York to Hamilton College, or whether or not I'm going somewhere like in Vermont or New Hampshire, going to Middlebury. I mean, you go through these areas and you see rural white poverty, and we act like that doesn't exist. And we act like crime isn't high there. We act like drugs aren't a problem there, right? And so we have to stop doing that. We have to stop being one-sided. So, but back to Michael Jordan. This dude was in Chicago. This stuff has happened on the South Side, been happening for decades. And he goes, Democrats and Republicans buy shoes. Essentially he was like, I don't have anything to do with the crime that's happening in local black communities, right? While people are lining up to buy shoes. And see, for people who have a problem with people lining up to buy shoes, let me tell you about the shoes. See, status operates in different ways. And if you're in a neighborhood where people don't have jobs, where people don't have houses, where people don't own property, where the schools aren't good, people look to gain status in other ways. And clothing The way people express themselves through their presentation of self becomes one of the ways they do that. We see that all across, right? In Tennessee, people like buying big trucks, putting mufflers, putting big rims on it with systems. Black dudes aren't doing that. White dudes are doing that, right? But we don't necessarily talk about that in the same way that they're gaining status, the same way a dude in the hood might get a Cutlass Supreme and throw some 20-inch rims on it with a system. Like the processes are exactly the same. They're just trying to gain local status, right? So that's just not that big of a deal. Instead, people need jobs. People need opportunities. And hopefully some of the things Michael Jordan is going to do is going to contribute to that. But he needs to go back to Chicago and help some of the things that's happening in those local communities, right? So that ancient black activists is crawled up in Michael Jordan, keep doing more, right? And for all those people who felt like Michael Jordan, who felt like this stuff didn't concern you, you need to get an ancient activist crawling up in you too, right? And maybe for Michael Jordan, activist is a strong word. Philanthropist probably be a little bit better. And I think there's another part of this. See, Michael Jordan went from being the best player in the league to just being one billionaire owner. He's the only black NBA owner. He walks up in those meetings. We got to think Donald Sterling was in those meetings, right? Donald Sterling, obviously, who ended up being forced to sell his team for the level of prejudice and racial discrimination he was putting on his players, his team, and also some of the things he owned, property and other businesses, right? And you can look that up. But the interesting thing is now Michael Jordan is the only black person in this space. So that same level of tokenism that Dr. D. Harvey Wingfield, who's at WashU, talks about in her book, No More Invisible Man, where she looks at the experiences of black male professionals who are doctors, lawyers, business execs, professors. That's the same thing Michael Jordan's going through. So now he's on the other side of the coin. He's like, holy crap, man, I'm getting screwed, man. They treat me like I'm just, like I'm nothing, right? And so that level of nepotism and privilege that's in that NBA owner space, now Michael Jordan is experiencing in a way that he didn't experience as a player, right? So I mean, these are just some possibilities as to why we see it. But regardless of the reason why that ancient black activist crawled up in Michael Jordan's body, I'm liking it, and I hope that it does more, right? And you need to figure out how to get that ancient black activist crawling up in you too, because we need everybody to contribute to making sure that everybody can live in an equitable society. So as always, conversations matter like Black Lives and Books, and I hope this has sparked one.